welcome to our webinar on building a person-centered plan around a meaningful long-term goal statement. My name is Robin Sotorina, and I am a Human Service Program Consultant at the Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Use Services. My pronouns are she and her, and for those with visual impairments, I'm a white woman with brown hair. I'm wearing glasses. I have a brown sweater on, and my background shows some of the Department of Health and Human Service company values. Thank you so much for joining us today to explore the very important ways to create meaningful long-term goal statements in the person-centered planning process. At this time, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Janice Tondora with the Yale Program for Recovery and Community Health.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Robin, for getting us kicked off. Before I tell you a little bit more about myself, I'm just going to highlight a couple of key housekeeping items here. We are going to mute audio for all participants today because we are expecting potentially a maxed out full house at 500 people as we get rolling here. So you can unmute as needed. However, please feel free to put any comments or questions into the chat box. We really hope that you're going to be active in that way. If you have technical issues, please direct those questions to our colleague Ingrid Padgett in the chat box. And keep in mind that you must participate in the full duration of today's event if you want to qualify for the NBCC certificate hours of completion that are associated with today's event. I also want to make sure that you're using a unique link from one device, and be sure to complete our post-event training survey that NBCC requires. You're going to have 2 weeks to do that. At the end of today's training, I'll give you a QR code and a link. And honestly, it could take you 30 seconds to do. So I just encourage everyone to please do it right away, both for securing your NBCC certificates, but also because we really do look at that feedback and adjust what we're doing as we go. So stay tuned. There will be more information on that moving ahead at the end of the presentation. I will also say, people always ask, will we be getting the slides? Yes, you will be getting a copy of the slides as well as a recording. Those will go out in post-event follow-up communications. And again, please do be prepared. I've built in a lot of different interactives to today's conversation, so please be prepared to respond to polls, to actively use your chat box. That's going to be a better experience for me and for you in terms of the learning. And we are going to try to save some time at the end for questions. When you do put questions into the chat box with a group this size, please don't direct them only to me because it will be difficult for me to track those. Please direct them to everyone because folks on our team are helping to monitor that so we can circle back at the end and hit your questions, okay? So just a little bit about me. If it's a first time you've been in one of our webinars, my name is Janice Tondora. I use she, her, hers pronouns for accessibility purposes. I am a white woman with long blonde hair. And today I am wearing a white button-down shirt with black dandelions, and I'm sitting in front of an image of the snow-covered Yale campus. From a professional perspective, I am a clinical psychologist by training, an associate professor at a place called the Program for Recovery and Community Health. You can read a little bit more about my background up there, but essentially I've dedicated the last 25 years of my career to really translating person-centered concepts and theory into person-centered practice guidelines. And I do that work in lots of states around the country, including in the state of North Carolina. And I'll tell you a little bit about the history of that initiative in a moment. I also bring a personal lived experience to today's event and to my work around the country, which is that I have family members that I have supported through experiences of severe brain injury, support a young adult who has experienced really significant mental health consequences. I always say being neurodivergent in a pretty neurotypical world. So I've learned a lot about navigating systems and how important and impactful person-centered care can be. So I hope that that combination of professional and personal experience is helpful for you today. So that's just a little bit about me. I'm going to ask for Ingrid's support here in the background, if she can open our first poll, because it would be helpful for me today to get a sense of who is in the room with us. And you may be wearing multiple hats that you see on the screen. So please go ahead and respond to our poll so I can get a sense of participants and think about how to tailor my comments. Just a few more seconds. All right, Ingrid, if you could go ahead and close that poll and share our results, that would be great. All right. Okay, so as has been the case with most of our webinars, we've got a pretty diverse audience with us today, people who are working in professional capacities, whether that's in leadership, administration, direct service provision. Always happy to see good representation from families and individuals with lived experience, including our peer specialists. And we've got a few folks that come out of the Tailored Plan Managed Care Organization context. And let me see if there's anything else in the chat that I have missed. We've got some vocational specialists, some QI folks. Excellent. Great, great. Okay, Ingrid, we can close that poll. And let me move on here. Let me just tell you a little bit about the historical context that led up to today's webinar, because North Carolina has a long history of working to move person-centered care from theory to practice. That dates back all the way to the Thomas S. class action work that happened in the early 90s, which focused on really trying to support people with disabilities and moving out of more institutional environments into their least restrictive environment in the community. Many of you may have been involved in some of those pioneering efforts, whether that was as a person-centered thinking ambassador or in the context of doing PCP yourselves with the folks that you were supporting. And many of you may have built on that in the subsequent years. There's been a lot of nice stuff that's happened in the mental health recovery-oriented care space, and many of you may have been involved in that effort to implement more person-centered models. And despite some of those efforts, and despite a lot of the progress that had been made in the field, some of the desk reviews and the quality reviews had indicated that the state was not exactly where it wanted to be consistently and universally. And so they recognized the need for ongoing support in this area. They formed a multi-year, multi-stakeholder, person-centered planning work group, most notably and critically made sure to include people and families with lived experience in that work group. And they updated the North Carolina Person-Centered Planning Guidance document. And that document sets out the standards for what the state would like person-centered planning to look like for those who are served, and also offers an introductory person-centered planning template. Then, in order to be able to meet the expectations that are outlined in that guidance document, the state offered widespread training and a series of introductory webinars throughout 2022 and 2023. I was the primary facilitator of those live webinars. And then subsequently, those live webinars were transformed into a 3-hour version of that introductory PCP training that is housed on the Behavioral Health Springboard website, free and available for anyone to take at any time. And I'm going to do another poll here in a second to get a sense of who has taken that training already or not. For now, what I will tell you is that you'll see there's a link in the slides that'll take you directly to that training, and really strongly encourage folks to take it if you haven't. But in addition to training, the state recognizes the ongoing need for additional tools and resources. So I'm also in a minute going to tell you a little bit more about kind of a hot off the presses terrific resource that we just launched before the holidays that I want to make sure everyone is aware of, because it has direct relevance to today's topic and kind of the co-creation of those long-term and short-term goals in the PCP. So let me get a sense of, again, in the audience, how many of you have taken either the live version or the BHS archived online version of that training? So please go ahead and respond to that poll. All right, Ingrid, you can go ahead and close that. Looks like we've got a good majority. 63% of you have already taken that course. For the 37% of you that haven't taken that course, again, really strongly encourage you to check it out. Our feedback and evaluation data suggests that people have found it really helpful. In addition, the completion of that online introductory course basically unlocks access to a really nice resource, which is called the Person-Centered Planning Resource Toolkit that we launched just before the holidays. And this is housed in the BHS platform. And it includes a really extensive library of articles, guides, webinars, videos, tip sheets, all to support your PCP implementation. And what we did was we basically curated the best of the best resources from all around the country for innovators in the PCP space, including trying to spotlight some of your local innovators here in North Carolina. So it includes lots of great materials that come out of the person-centered thinking work, where Michael Small has been a leader along with his colleagues at Support Development Associates. It includes great stuff out of the Charting the Life course model, which comes out of the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Of course, it includes a range of the materials we've developed in PCP out of the Yale Program for Recovery and Community Health. But in an effort, in order to spotlight your homegrown innovation, it also includes great stuff, for example, that has come out of the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities. They've got some excellent tools and toolkits as it relates to supporting community living, developing natural sports, all of which goes hand in hand with good quality goal setting and person-centered planning. So within this website, part of the reason I want to point it out to you is that you have the ability. We organized things in addition to a general search function where you can type in what you're looking for. We also organized things into buckets of topical categories. One of those buckets and topical categories is actually titled Goal and Vision Setting and Person-Centered Planning. So again, just encouragement to take that introductory course to access this resource toolkit. There's really a wealth of information there that's going to support your efforts moving forward. All right, I am going to first, I'm going to ask you all a question to get us going. And I want to illustrate the importance of attending what is important to a person with a disability when you sit down with them and their family to create a person-centered plan. So the first question I want to ask you is think about how we traditionally define improvement for people who are living with complex disabilities and health conditions, okay? Whether that's serious mental illnesses, autism, brain injury, intellectual and developmental disabilities. It could be people aging with severe dementia. But I want you to think about in traditional healthcare systems, what do we traditionally define as improvement for those populations? What do we historically measure? What do we value in terms of outcomes? To be clear, I'm giving you permission to take off your person-centered hats and really think about traditional medical model programs. What do we historically focus on? Okay, so I will get us started. In the mental health space, historically, we focus on medication compliance. If you're an aging person with dementia, or maybe a kiddo with IDD having a hard time at school, we might focus a lot on behavioral outbursts, okay? So put some ideas in the chat for me about the kinds of ways we traditionally define improvement, what we traditionally measure. Sorry, folks, I had a glitch in my slides here. I didn't mean to do that, drawing on them. All right, so go ahead and put that in the chat. Symptom reduction, decreased hospitalization, improved behavior, decreased crisis, achieve and maintain clinical stability, compliance of all shapes and sizes, staying out of hospitals. Where else do we not want people to go? We don't want them to end up where? We don't want them to end up in, some folks end up entangled in what system? Yeah, there you go. So yeah, so incarcerated, in jail, unhoused, okay? How about, think about people who may be struggling with different functional day-to-day issues based on their experience of a disability or a health condition. Traditionally, what do we focus on? Traditionally, it's a 3-letter acronym. What's a 3-letter acronym? Where are my rehabilitation folks? Yeah, ADLs, activities of daily living. Okay, good, good. All right, now here's what I want you to do, okay? I want you to take off your professional hats and I want you to think about yourself as a human being. And in the chat box, I just want you to spontaneously write down the 3 most important things in your life that give your life meaning. They may be the roles that you play. They may be what gives you purpose, what brings you joy. I want you to write 3 things into the chat box, okay? Family, work, my husband, my kids, my faith and spirituality, my furry family, could be my cats or my dogs or my feathered friends, getting out in my community, connection, God, being a good mom, volunteering, giving back to others, being with animals. Travel, culture, exercise, nature. Okay, I'm just reading all the things that are coming into the chat box here. Okay, great, excellent. So here's what I want you, Ingrid, what have I done here? I must have on, I've got on a marker and I'm sorry about the little red lines here. At a break, I'm gonna turn it off, but what I want you to do here, you can still see the slide. When I asked you to think about how do we traditionally define improvement for people living with disabilities and complex health conditions, we got a list that looked a lot like the list on the left. But then when I asked you to think about yourself as a human being, what matters most to you in your life, what's important to you as a human being, we got a list that looked a lot like the list on the right. So I just want to invite some comments into the chat box. How do you think these 2 lists are different? Point out some ways for me in the chat box for how these 2 things are different. How do they feel different? Yeah, the left is very jargonish and detached. The left is very clinical, is being pointed out. I do want to say that's true, but clinical is not a bad word in the person-centered planning space. It just means that we don't want to clutter up the plan and have it exclusively dominated by clinical jargon. The right side is much more personable. On the left side, it feels like a person has less control over their lives. It feels like things that are being imposed on people, whereas the right side is much more personal, okay? Sometimes the way that the difference between these two lists is described is that on the left side of the list is what we tend to think is important for people from a professional perspective. But on the right-hand side of the list is what is most important to them as human beings. And when we co-create a good person-centered plan with people in their families, we have to make sure that is driven by and stays true to those things on the right, okay? And we struggle to really integrate these two things into one good quality plan. So that's what we're actually going to talk a lot about today, and in particular, what that looks like as you're co-creating those long-term and those short-term goals, okay? Brandon, you have had your hand up for a while. Do you need to unmute or do you need technical support? I want to give you an opportunity if you need some help here. Let us know, okay? In the meantime, my last question for you all with the chat box. Think of your list of 3 things for yourself, okay? Whether you wrote them in the chat, whether you have them on a piece of paper, whether they're up here in your head. And just imagine for a moment that I am crossing the second thing off of your list and taking that out of your life for even a short period of time. And I just want to ask you in the chat box, tell me how that would feel for you. What kind of emotional reaction would that invoke? It would make me angry. It'd be devastating. It'd be scary, dehumanizing. I would lose my purpose. It would be devastating. I would feel completely helpless and lost. Okay. All right. So let me make an analogy here. Okay. We have made a lot of progress in person-centered planning in the disability space, especially in recent years, but we still have a ways to go. And people with disabilities still will report that treatment planning still feels like a place where they go every 3 months, 6 months, every year, and someone else in the room other than them has the power to decide what 2 goals end up on that treatment plan and what ends up getting crossed off or deferred. Okay, so think about a person who has a disability, who's been in and out of adult care homes and institutions, and more than anything else, before they die, they want a key to their own apartment in the community, okay? And they go to their treatment planning meeting, and the message that they get is, we know that's important to you, but until you've been med compliant for 6 months, we really can't support your transition to the community. So in that moment, what the person experiences is that a home of their own has gotten crossed off their list as a goal. Medication compliance has put on the plan as a priority. Or a person who's struggling with substance use issues. And more than anything, they want to be a good provider for their family. And they want to get a job or they want to get their job back. And the message that they hear in a treatment planning meeting still sometimes can be, we know that's important to you, but until you have 90 days of clean tox screens, I'm not going to sign off on your referral to the supported employment program. So in that moment, abstinence and compliance gets put on the plan and the pursuit of the job gets crossed off, okay? So let me be very clear in this exercise. I am not suggesting that the 250 plus people on this call, none of us go in this business to cross anything off of anyone's list, okay? But because of a wide variety of different pressures in our field, it could be how we're trained, it could be how we're financed, it could be what supervision looks like. We have a tendency when we create service plans for everything that's on the left up here to end up crowding out these things that are important to people on the right. Then what you see happen in those circumstances is that, people really start to feel all the same feelings that you just put into the chat, okay? Angry, hopeless, disengaged. And so really this model, when you think about goal setting with people, we have to fundamentally come back to this fact that get past this us them mentality, right? Because people with mental health diagnoses, developmental disabilities, substance use, aging, TBI, they generally want the same things in life as all people. And just like you put in the chat box, they want to thrive. They don't just want to survive, right? Their disabilities and health conditions. And goal setting and person-centered planning is one tool that can help them to really do just that, okay? So let me move on and let me give you a big picture, overarching view of what the logic model in person-centered planning documentation looks like, okay? And then I'm going to spend a fair amount of the time that we have, in particular, offering definitions, functions, and examples around well-written long-term goal statements, as well as how those can be followed up by your short-term goal statements, which meet your SMART criteria. And some of you may historically refer to that middle element of the plan, or you may refer to that as a short-term objective. In the PCP guidance document and the template, the term short-term goal is what is used, but just for the sake of clarity and make sure we're all on the same page, know that what we're talking about there is that measurable short-term objective. But from a big picture perspective, really, first and foremost, good person-centered plans start with, flow from, and stay true to those long-term goals that are most important to the person and the family. Then we're going to have strengths and assets that they can draw upon that we need to learn how to explore in different ways. But we're also going to have barriers and assessed needs that we have uncovered in our assessments, in our conversations, in our observations that are interfering with those long-term goals. So I'm going to talk a lot about this a little bit later, but just keep in mind, for those of you that are sitting there already wondering and really struggling, that, where does the medical necessity live within this person-centered planning documentation? It's going to live in many places throughout your record, but one place in particular where it really lives is in the clear behavioral documentation of those functional impairments related to the disability in that barriers and assessed needs box, okay? So that doesn't get crowded out of the plan. It still lives there. We just think about those things insofar as how they get in the way of the goal. And I'm going to give you lots of examples. We'll also walk through what it looks like to write that meaningful, but yet measurable, SMART short-term goal. And then finally, we're not going to get into this detail today because our focus is on those two highlighted with the yellow arrow components. But then the final question is, how does the entire team, including both professional and natural supporters, come together in support of the person to help them achieve these long and short-term goals? So to be clear, as it relates to your suggested template, again, these are the elements that we're talking about, and these are the fields that we're going to be talking about in the plan, okay? So let's start with a little bit about, actually, before I do that, I just saw a prompt to myself. For those of you that haven't taken the introductory training, or if you are not familiar with this PCP guidance document and suggested template that I've referred to a few times, if I could ask Ingrid, if you could please drop those links into the chat if you have not done so already, that would be great. All right, so let's dive in. Long-term goals. What are they? Why are they important? Let me give you some tips about how you document them, and also offer you some examples. So These long-term goals, remember, these are meaningful life changes longer term, okay? They should be owned by the person in the family and reflect those things that are most important to them in their lives as a whole, not just what's most important to them in treatment, right? So be thinking about the three things that each of you wrote down into the chat box when I did that opening exercise with all of you, okay? So ideally, your long-term goal, they are reflected in quotes of the individual or the family, okay? Now, a question sometimes come up. I got one yesterday. It reminded me to address this. Someone asked the questions, well, what parts of the plan, the PCP, do you write in quotations in the person's own words, or do you even write the entire plan in the person's own words? So I would say that really depends on what kind of plan you are writing. There certainly are examples in the field of purely self-directed person-centered planning models, things like making action plans, things like wellness recovery action planning that tend to exist independent of. So they're a supplement to formal services and not a replacement for them. Okay, so in those types of plans, you do tend to see a much heavier, more prominent inclusion of quotes, okay? But just for the sake of clarity, the type of PCP documentation and the person-centered planning that we're talking about within the context of this initiative and this webinar is the actual service plan that direct support professionals are required to create in partnership with an individual and family about the types of services and supports they're providing, okay? So because we're talking about the formal service plan here, the PCP has to, yes, first and foremost, honor the person, but it does also still need to satisfy the chart, okay? And by that, I mean that those of you who are writing these understand that there are multiple administrative and fiscal functions that the plan also plays. So for that reason, when you think about the language that the PCP is written in, I typically tend to recommend a hybrid of voice that wherever possible incorporates the voice of lived experience in quotations, but also typically speaking, in order to satisfy all of those requirements, and also to acknowledge the important value of professional supporters, it's going to exist also alongside some professional voice in the plan, okay? So as it relates to the long-term goal statement specifically, I would say more so than any other part of the plan, that's the one that you really want to try to write that in quotes of the individual or family, okay? It should be their vision of a good life that then guides the actions of the entire team, okay? And things ideally are written in positive terms and reflect what a person is moving toward in their life rather than just problems that they're trying to get rid of. And I'm going to, again, give you lots of examples of this. But the key thing when you're writing those long-term goals is that you don't want them to be limited simply to the management of behavior problems or symptoms. They really should be about quality of life, okay? Oftentimes, they reflect a desire for people to have greater independence and self-determination, whether that's around choice in where they live, who they love, the kinds of medications they use, who manages their money, you name it, okay? Obviously, that is going to vary widely based on individual and especially cultural worldview, but it's not uncommon that we see a theme sort of pop up in those long-term goal statements around, again, wanting more autonomy and decision-making, okay? So why is getting to the important two so critical in person-centered planning, especially as it relates to goal setting? And I've coined this phrase, borrowed it from my dear friend and colleague, Amanda Bowman, out in Texas, who does some great work in the PCP space. And what she talks about is we can't know what a person needs in terms of services and supports until we first really deeply understand what it is they want, right? And what's most important to them in their lives, not just what's most important in terms of treatments and supports. So that means we really need to think about the bigger picture of the long-term goal statement, and then the rest of the plan should align with that accordingly. So I am very open and have written a bit about this because I have my own personal experience over a decade of a very serious medical condition. And so I've navigated lots of treatment plan meetings with doctors and specialists. And 10 years ago, I had a major brain surgery where they had to remove a brain tumor that was threatening because it was located on my brainstem. Okay, so risks of that surgery were very, very high. And I sat down with my specialists to come up with a treatment plan. And there were two ways of doing that treatment. In option A, there was a 5% chance of cognitive and neurological issues, right? Very small chance. But doctors were 99% confident that they could protect my hearing, right? That they would be able to preserve my hearing, that I wouldn't go deaf, okay? Option B, there was 0 chance of neurological damage that would create cognitive or personality issues, but I was guaranteed to go deaf and lose my balance hearing and have tinnitus on one side, okay? And initially there was this conversation around how we were going to do this. And, the doctors were, we're going to go with option A. That's really what's in your best interest, because the risk around neurological damage and cognitive issues, it's really small, and we're confident we can protect that. So that's your best option. That's what's in your best interest. And I had to catch my breath and go back after and say, absolutely not. I will definitively 100% take a chance of losing my hearing and losing my balance over having even a 1% chance of neurological damage that is going to change who I am and how I think, right? Because what's most important to me in my life is being a mom and being a teacher and being a good partner, okay? I don't need my hearing to do that. It doesn't define me, okay? So I use that as an example because we couldn't get to the right treatment option unless my surgical team really understood what was most important to me. So you gotta be able to dig deeper. If I had been an award-winning opera singer, I had played the piano, and really music is what defined my life, preserving my hearing may have been more important to me, okay? But you have to take the time to figure out what is most critical to each person and family member, okay? So let me just give you some examples of these. I'll keep weaving in documentation tips. Again, as I said, a lot of times goals will resolve around things like independence. I want to be able to control my own money or my meds. I want to be able to move out of the group home, go back to church and experience my faith community. Maybe I want to have friends at school, or maybe I want to volunteer at the senior center. But at the end of the day, what you see in these long-term goal statements is that fundamentally what people want is to live, love, work, learn, play, and pursue their dreams in the community. That's really beautiful language that comes out of the North Carolina PCP Guidance document, okay? And what they don't want for their long-term goals on their plans are things that devolve to the territory of very traditional treatment plan documentation, okay? No one's goals in life are to decrease their aggression, improve their hygiene, comply with their meds, and follow our behavioral plans, okay? Please know that I'm not saying that those things on the screen are a bad thing, okay? There may be many ways that we can and should intervene to support people around these issues, but they should not be showing up in the long-term goal statements because these are not people's vision of a good life. That's not what they reflect, okay? These are the kinds of long-term life vision goals typically you want to see, okay? I want to have friends and get invited to the birthday parties of my classmates. I want to live in my own apartment. I want to be a mechanic or get custody of my kids, right? The reason some of these goals, it's critical when you're documenting the plan, because how we're thinking about and documenting these things really says a lot about how we're engaging and motivating people, right? So look at the comparisons in the screen here, right? What goal would you want to work in your PCP, in your plan, right? I want to have friends and family back in my life, or patients going to experience improvements in interpersonal boundaries and socialization, communication, and relational skills. Okay. I don't even know what that means on the right-hand side. That's not going to resonate with a person. Okay. So let me offer some examples that help you think about how we transform from more traditional, narrow problem and pathology based goals on the left-hand side of the list, and how we transform those into more forward-thinking, person-centered goals on the right, okay? Not the patient will be med and treatment compliant, but I want to go to college. And yes, maybe learning how to use my medications effectively and take advantage of the services you're offering me is going to be a part of my PCP, but it's not going to be the long-term goal, okay? Similarly, maybe you have a student who's struggling with behavior in the classroom. On the left, we would see Joe's going to have decreased outbursts in class. But then we have to really ask the question, if we can achieve that, why is it important to Joe and what's it going to allow him to do? Well, I want to be able to go on the field trips. I haven't been allowed to go on the field trips in the past, and I really want to enjoy those things with my friends. Okay. So just sometimes it helps to illustrate by contrasting. Okay. I think we're doing okay on time. So what I'm going to do is, because I have those two, Ingrid, is it the annotate function that I need to clear everything? How do I clear the two little red marks that are on my screen? I apologize, everyone.
Yes.
All
I
right. So
think it is. You can also close this and not save it and bring back up your original slide deck, which won't have that.
all right, let me see here. Let me see. Bear with me, folks. And Robin, if you happen to see, since I've been talking for a while now, if you happen to see anything in the chat that you think is important for me to address.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. I
Monique,
did it, by the way. I did it.
yay! Monique
Sorry.
has asked, do we have to address the diagnoses for the goal?
So you are going to address functional impairments and distress and disruptions to a person's life that are a result of their experience of a diagnosis or a health condition within the plan as a whole. But typically speaking, you're not going to see that show up at the level of the long-term goal, okay? Where are you going to tend to see that show up is more so in your documentation of your barriers, your assessed needs, whether that lives in the assessment, the plan, or a combination of both. It's going to show up in how you target your short-term SMART goals around those barriers and overcoming them. And it also will show up in the professional services that document who is providing what and why as it relates to overcoming those issues associated with the diagnosis. So we're going to take a look at a few examples of that. I think it was Monique, so stay tuned. In the plan as a whole, you're required to address it. It's not what we want to be talking about at the level of the long-term goal, okay? What else, Robin? Anything else?
We've got another question. Abby asks, how do we navigate the MCOs dictating clinical goals being present in order to obtain ACT services?
So that is actually something, Abby, that I have a specific slide on, and we're going to talk a little bit about it in a couple of minutes. So let's just hold that thought, because I promise you we'll get there, okay? All right. All right, so let me just get out of here. All right, I'm so glad that I removed those. Apologies again, folks. Okay. All right, so let's talk about some of the frequently asked questions that come up. And I just chose an assortment of these. These are things that have come up on previous webinars that I have done. These are things that have been reported in evaluations. These may be things that are on your minds. If you have other questions on your minds, please do continue to use the chat box so we can try to come back to those at the end, okay? So, if the person isn't coming up with anything, right? They say, they want to work on their meds and their hygiene as a focus of their plan. So that's what I wrote in the long-term goal, okay? So even just thinking about my own clinical experience, I can remember years ago sitting down and talking with people. I think of one gentleman in particular, and trying to have the conversation where I would like expand the vision and say, listen, this organization is really committed to doing this thing called person-centered planning. And here's how it's a little different, because we really want to follow your lead. And we want to focus on what's most important to you in your life and what you want that to look like. How do you want to spend your time? Who do you want to spend it with? So let's talk about the goals that you might want to have shaping this PCP. And I can think of people who would say to me, in my work in the adult mental health space, I'm going to take my meds. I'll come see you once a week. And if a voice tells me to hurt myself, I promise I'll go straight to the ER and check myself in. Are we done with the plan now, and can we get coffee? Okay. I could have just written med compliance, attend treatment on the plan. But if I took a step back for a moment, I would have to acknowledge those are not his vision of a good life. That is what he has been socialized to based on a very narrow model of service planning that he's experienced as a service recipient after decades of being treated in the adult mental health system, okay? So service recipients and families sometimes lose the ability to dream around some of these things, okay? And sometimes they may be, the biggest obstacle may be helping them to expand their vision, okay? So what we need to be thinking of here is that we've really got to be doing direct education and capacity building among people with lived experience, okay, to really expand their frame, to get into their hands all sorts of worksheets around strengths-based interest inventories. I'm going to share a few examples of that in a moment, because while we have made progress, again, assessments and conversations that happen prior to and during the development of the PCP, they often don't adequately really explore or uncover what I sometimes call those kind of golden nuggets, that you really need to write a good person-centered plan, okay? So some reminders in PCP goal setting. I guess I would say, in what context? Like, imagine you're at a job interview or you're at a college interview, and people tell you, well, tell me about your goals in life, okay? The language of goals is intimidating. That's an intimidating question to respond to. There's a lot of pressure around that, okay? And that's for, I think, any human being, not just a person who's living with a health condition or a disability, okay? So recognizing that the language of goal setting can be intimidating for people, we have to think about different and creative ways of asking the question to get to that good quality long-term goal statement, right? So I've learned a lot from our peer specialists who work with us on our research and our service projects here at Yale. And going back probably 15 years ago to one big project we had, it was focused on, vocational interests and that type of thing, some more vocational planning. And, people were really struggling to, respond to these questions about, tell me about your vocational goals or tell me about your vocational interests. And one of our peer specialists one day just started experimenting and asked a question. Think back to before all the struggles started. And when you were a kid, what did you dream of being when you grew up? What did you hope you would be doing? Okay. And just something about mentally putting the person back in that place and reconnecting to those sparks that they had as a kid could sometimes lead to really rich conversations that could then inform the development of the PCP and the long-term goal, okay? This does not happen immediately out of the gate, okay? People are vulnerable when they put themselves out there and start talking about their goals. So this takes time and a trusting relationship. The process of goal setting really unfolds through reflective listening. And I can almost guarantee that the kinds of goals that you're going to be able to solicit when you're doing an intake to services is very likely not the same thing as what you're going to get 6 months or a year down the road. So it's really important to sort of revisit those goals, as your connection deepens with the people and the families that you serve, right? Sometimes, just as I was saying in that gentleman that I supported years ago, it is the person themselves that is very narrowly focused on goals that are really, they're targeted specifically on symptoms, pathologies, behavior. Sometimes that's because that's how they've been socialized. But sometimes, again, it's because they've lost this vision that it can be bigger than that, and they've lost some hopefulness around that. So you're a partner in this too. And just remember that, if a person is saying to you, I want to feel less depressed for their long-term goal and their plan, or it's a student and they're saying, I know I need to stop losing control in class. Okay, so that's focused on eliminating a negative behavior instead of reflecting the more, quote, important to life goals that could get them to. Okay, so that's where you use your very best engagement skills as practitioners, and you have the conversation with people. If you were less depressed, if you felt more in control, what might you be doing? How would you spend your time, and who would you spend it with? How would life be different for you? Okay. Again, I'll offer a couple tools, things I want to make sure you have access to that can give you some strategies around this in a moment. If when you're struggling, the other thing to really remember is who else in the person's life can help with that long-term goal setting, okay? This is where we think about the other aspect of person-centered planning that is so critical, which is the invitation and the inclusion of natural supporters into the PCP process and into the goal setting, okay? If you are working with a young individual with autism who doesn't use verbal communication to communicate, I can guarantee you that their parent can tell you when their face lights up and what's important to them in their life to help us use that to shape the long-term goals. In some of the work that I've done in hospital-based settings, I have a colleague who shared his favorite story ever of the work that we had been doing in a hospital, and it was a state psychiatric hospital, and a woman had been on the unit for quite some time, and she was living with a diagnosis of schizophrenia and had been diagnosed as being catatonic, okay? And she would spend very, very long hours sitting in a chair with a fixed gaze. By everyone's account, she was very disengaged from the milieu and from the services. And she was not verbalizing, and they were really struggling to get the information they needed to create and craft a good person-centered plan, okay? So ultimately, they identified a sister in the community and brought the sister into the PCP meeting. And the first thing that the sister said in the meeting was, "Where's her glasses? She's missing her glasses. She needs her glasses." And so what they uncovered was that she, I think technically was legally blind and had very strong prescription corrective lenses, but they were also very expensive. So what had happened was some of the unit staff, they were afraid that if they got left on a chair or they got left out, that somebody might sit on them and damage them. And so they moved them to the nurse's station. So the poor woman, let's start with the basics and get her glasses, okay? Then the sister went on to talk about how share all this information about this woman, that when she's not in this kind of an acute crisis, she lives in the community, an apartment of her own. Her boyfriend comes to visit. She plays Sudoku. And guess what? She has a long history, not in recent years, but has worked as an ASL interpreter for the deaf. Okay? So all of this wealth of really rich information comes from the natural supporter in the person's life. And it wasn't magic, and it didn't eliminate the problems overnight, but that treatment team did one of the most beautiful interventions, and they had a deaf patient who was being served on another unit, and they transferred her into this unit. And again, it didn't happen overnight, but slowly that connection got made, and slowly the original woman started to engage in care, started to provide some help and support intermittently around this other deaf woman who was being treated in the hospital, and finally had some sense of purpose, in her life. So the goal on that PCP that all started with the natural support of the sister, it evolved from simple cookie cutter goals of medication compliance and increasing insight around schizophrenia to a goal of, I want to feel well enough to get back to my apartment and start volunteering again. Okay. So think about tapping all those natural supporters. And when in doubt, it is okay to use your own observations and make a suggestion to get the ball rolling. Sometimes when I say this, people will say, but I'm not supposed to do this because it's supposed to come directly from them. And that's true, but it's also true that not everyone is capable of doing that on their own. And you have close relationships, you have astute observational skills. If a person can't identify it on their own, it's perfectly okay for you to offer up a suggestion. So I number of years ago used to work in residential settings for youth and adults with autism. And I can think of someone in particular that did not use verbal language to communicate. And at times when they were really struggling with sensory overload, they'd get highly distressed and might even use self-injury in that immediate moment. But one thing that we noticed in the course of working with that person is that all of that stuff would calm down when the person was exposed to music, okay, as sort of a self-soothing strategy. So that's not a person verbally articulating in a quote the long-term goal in their PCP, but it's a really creative way to make sure that the context that you are pulling into that long-term goal is consistent with the things that are most important to them. Okay. All right, so here are just some samples of different strengths-based questions and inquiry conversation starters that can really help to support your goal setting in PCP. Many more of these are embedded in the PCP toolkit that I mentioned, again, that you can access through the BHS introductory training. What you're looking at up here are snapshots of handouts. These were written for some of my work on an NIH grant that was in the adult mental health space. So user-friendly handouts for the service recipient about how to help them think bigger about goals in person-centered planning. Those tools, as well as a wide variety of other tools, including the stuff out of the PCT, out of Michael Small's work, Charting a Life course, has a really beautiful user-friendly, it's a tool for developing a family vision and really developing that around sort of key domains of quality of life. So my message to you would be, if you haven't checked out the toolkit, please do. And really, we want you to access and use the tools that work best for you and the person or family that's sitting across from you, okay? Because people have different preferences and needs. And we're working to continuously build that website. One thing I don't think I said earlier is that we have collected a lot of those sort of national resources from across the major models of PCP. We pulled in some of your homegrown local stars and resources. If you have something that you are using in PCP goal setting with your service users with lived experience. If you think it's particularly useful, by all means, please do send it to us. We would love to gather those things and continuously grow and upload to this website over time. All right, I'm going to move a little quickly here to make sure we save time for questions, but want to address a few more FAQs. So I'm afraid their goal is not realistic, and I don't want to encourage it and set the person up for failure. Okay, so I think the thing that I would say first here is that none of us has a crystal ball to predict the future, right? My own parents didn't think I was going to graduate high school, let alone kind of go off to Yale and, you know, work here on the faculty. So sometimes, many times, you know, people do outlive and prove us that this legacy of low expectations that we have for people with disabilities or health conditions, in many ways, that is more damaging to a person than helping a person to think big, right? So when I was a kid and I was really struggling, and I was talking about wanting to go off to college and go off to Yale, nobody discouraged that, okay? Despite the fact that I was having some significant difficulties of my own at the time, okay? So keep in mind that achieving that long-term goal may not be the ultimate outcome, but it still may get the person moving and get them going in the right direction, okay? Because it serves as a motivator to the person. Right? So as an example, I can think of work that I did years ago supporting a woman with developmental disability, and she had been very focused on this goal of wanting to go to college. And through our PCP process, that ended up being set as the long-term goal within her PCP. And after about 6 months' time, what we discovered was, in fact, she didn't like college at all. She didn't think she was cut out for college, and she wanted to think about something else in the vocational space that she could do. However, what did happen once she was on that college campus was that she got a part-time job at the little student cafe and met someone working in that cafe and started having friends and, you know, had a date and started making meaningful connections. So it turned out that what was most important to her when she was talking about college was not the degree, it was about the social connection. And so just keep in mind that if we hadn't supported her in pursuing that goal around going back to college, we never would have known that, okay? So it is well intended that we don't want to set people up for failure. And people sometimes say, like, that's going to crush folks. Like, I don't think that that's realistic. But remember, at the level of the long-term goal, you want to think big. You're going to have other opportunities at the level of your short-term SMART objective to really break it down into those achievable and realistic first steps that are going to get them going in the right direction. I'm going to play a snippet of a brief video here just to mix it up a little bit. If you have not heard Pat Deegan speak, Pat is one of the most prominent person-centered recovery advocates in the mental health space, literally in the world. And she speaks very powerfully to her own lived experience of this process of goal setting and treatment planning.
Very early into being in the hospital, literally within a day, I was diagnosed with schizophrenia, undifferentiated type, with paranoid features. And that became the diagnosis, and that diagnosis took on what I call a master status in terms of my identity. The fact that I was Pat, the fact that there were many aspects to who I was as a person became absolutely irrelevant once I held this label, this diagnosis. What mattered was that I was a quote-unquote schizophrenic. In other words, my humanity seemed to others to be quite secondary. So the fact that I had friends, the fact that I was a good athlete, none of this seemed to matter. it was like wearing a scarlet letter in big neon lights. This is a disease, not a person. This is a disorder, not a person. So he felt like he knew my future. He had read a generic textbook and simply applied it to the case in front of him. Schizophrenics don't recover, Pat Deegan won't recover. And it was that simple. And he urged me to go into a halfway house and to go on Social Security and to essentially retire from life. And then I remember having a thought, and I had never had this thought before, but the thought came to me, I'm going to become Dr. Deegan and change the mental health system so that no one ever gets hurt in it again. Wow, that thought had never come to me before. And yet, it held me with a power. It became for me what I call a survivor's mission. In my own understanding of it, I believe that I have been called by a power greater than myself to do the work that has become my life work. I do not tell that to psychiatrists or treatment teams when I meet them. Miss Deegan, if I had gone to the treatment team then, Miss Deegan, what is your goal for your treatment planning this year? Well, doctor, I have been called by God to change the mental health system so that no one ever gets hurt in it again. Delusions of grandeur.
I'm just going to stop it there. I think
Very early into being in the
point that I was making, the power of purpose, right? And letting Pat hang on to that, right? And literally, it became her life's mission. And it was the reason that people dig in to do the hard work to get there, okay? All right, few more FAQs, documentation tips. This is one that came up quite a bit in our year one webinars. You know, can you really engage a person who has actively experienced psychosis in PCP goal setting? So it looks a little different and it can be complicated, right? But first, we got to ask the question, you know, are we sure that the symptoms are actually disrupting a person's life and interfering with goal attainment, right? Because it's often the case that people learn to live with some of these experiences, and in some cases may even find them helpful, a source of comfort, a source of company, you know, et cetera. I'm not trying to discount the fact that these experiences can create major disruptions in people's lives. What I am trying to encourage you to do in the PCP goal setting process is not so quickly rush to extinguish them, but be willing to authentically explore them with a person to get a sense of what kind of meaning that a fixed belief might have for them, because that can be really fruitful ground for creating the goals in a PCP. So a story that resonates for me on this point was someone who was living in an adult 24/7 group home, and he had a fixed belief that he had been a Grammy-winning, platinum-selling musician, and that the residential staff were stealing his royalties checks. And he was repeatedly calling local police. The police would come. There would inevitably, things would escalate. This would result in a person going back to the ER, potentially longer-term hospitalizations. And for the longest time, this person's plan was all about med compliance and increasing insight into delusions, okay? But when some really thoughtful people on that team explored it more deeply with the person, they reached out and talked to natural supporters in the person's network. It in fact turned out that he was an incredibly accomplished saxophone player. And in fact, years ago, he had played at one of the most prominent, famous up-and-coming jazz clubs in New York City, okay? So again, not magic to erase how some of those experiences were disrupting his life, but that then helped them create a long-term goal on that plan that was about volunteering at a local community center to teach the kids how to play saxophone, okay? So again, even in experiences of psychosis, they can have meaning. And then the final FAQ, this goes back to Abby's question, which is one that is often on people's minds, right? So with all this talk about person-centered long-term goal statements, where and how in the plan do you tackle the problems and support your payment for services, okay? So there are some really widely held misperceptions out in the field as a whole that person-centered planning and its documentation is somehow soft, okay? So if you went through the introductory training, or anybody who's been in documentation training with me will see that there are very high standards around the rigor of the documentation. And you can do that and both honor the person's goal and still satisfy the chart, okay? And your medical necessity requirements within your documentation. But it may look a little different from how you've traditionally done it. Because when the problems are not directly targeted in the long-term goals, you have to be very cognizant of making sure that you are still responding to those issues you've identified in the assessment, that you are still addressing your medical necessity and your justification of services in many other places within the record, okay? It's just not necessarily going to show up at the level of the long-term goal. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So what I will say here to Abby's question is that not just in North Carolina, but in every state that I've done this work, any agency I've done this work, coordination across the organizational leadership and the people who are funding the services, it's absolutely critical in promoting consistency and quality expectations and in messaging, okay? I recognize that there's more work that needs to be done. I believe the state recognizes that. I think you've got some nice examples that are already out there with the PCP guidance document, seeking to really put this stuff down in writing and to get some clarity around the documentation components, both the process and the documentation. In addition, while we're not quite ready to announce it on this webinar, I do want you to know that this exact type of training and a webinar is going to be offered directly to TP audiences with details coming soon. So there are attempts to offer this, again, across diverse stakeholder audiences so we can really align everyone, you know, in the service of this larger goal and satisfying the overall expectations in the guidance document. This slide represents the tension that Abby and others are sort of bringing up, like, I get caught between a rock and a hard place, and how do I balance these tensions within the context of the plan? One answer to that is that, again, remember the clear behavioral description of functional impairments, health and safety issues that are directly associated to a person's experience of a diagnosis, a disability, a mental health condition. They can be woven throughout the record. They can be in the barrier section. They can also show up in the short-term objectives. How that actually looks is a little bit different, okay? So historically, we organize plans on the left-hand side of the list. And for every problem identified in the assessment, we attach a goal to it. So you have assaultive behavior, your goal is to be assault-free. You have poor hygiene, you know, your goal is to shower and bathe regularly, you know, et cetera, et cetera. But in the person-centered world, we take the time to explore the important too. That becomes a long-term goal statement. I want my job back so I can provide for my kids. But maybe I have had physical conflicts with coworkers that have led to my termination in the past. That's a concrete barrier, and you can attach a smart short-term objective to it. Same thing with the difficulty with the self-care. I need to put my best foot forward when I'm going on job interviews or going to pick up applications. So you might have a short-term SMART goal around the area of self-care and hygiene, okay? To give you an example that might come out of the space of supporting a youth with developmental disability, you know, again, problem-centered on the left-hand side, but then on the right-hand side, what we're talking about, what's most important to the student is I want to play basketball at recess with my classmates and nobody, is letting me play with them or nobody wants to play with me, okay? So in this case, then what you're thinking about, well, what are the barriers from the assessment, from our observations, from the conversation that might be getting in the way? Maybe the person has limited verbal communication, and maybe when they have a hard time expressing themselves, they're having some behavioral issues that are isolating them from peers because peers feel unsafe. Maybe when they feel excluded, they tend to run, okay? Maybe they're struggling with sensory integration issues and they're masturbating in public spaces, which is making peers uncomfortable, okay? On the left-hand side, we would resort back to identifying all those things as inappropriate behaviors and problems, which leads to a pretty punitive approach to a treatment plan. But we have an opportunity when we write a person-centered plan to operate from different assumptions, and operating from assumptions that all human behavior is communication and our least restrictive interventions should be used. And even masturbation is a normal and healthy expression of sexuality, okay? And when we start with those kinds of assumptions, we get to a much more non-judgmental place and much more positive behavioral supports. Maybe we're offering more activity options, more social opportunities, maybe more non-sexual sensory input, whether that's music, massage, swimming, fidget toys, etc. So again, just trying to illustrate how we're not neglecting the barriers and we're not neglecting the problems identified in the assessment. They're just typically going to show up more so at the level of your barriers and your short-term SMART goals, whereas the stuff that's important to the person most often is going to manifest at the level of the long-term goal statement, okay? All right. Our charge today was to focus very heavily on the quality of those long-term goal statements, but I do want to end and save a couple minutes for questions and just give you some key tips around writing those short-term goals. Again, remember, some of you may refer to these objectives. So first of all, what do these short-term goals do? And what are they? They're concrete changes in behavior, changes in functioning, changes in status that really are the proof that a person is getting closer to that long-term goal. They are the proof that they are overcoming documented disability-related issues, concerns, functional impairments to achieve the things that matter to them in their lives. So in this sense, they send a really hopeful message that we think things can and will be different in a pretty short amount of time, okay? So what I always encourage people to think about when you're weaving this thread from the long to the short-term goal is you think about the long-term goal, then you reflect back with a person, everything we've learned together in our time together in conversations and assessments. What are the things that are actually getting in the way of that long-term goal for you? And what can we tackle first, right? And what you want to do is you want to be thinking about something that's going to represent a change that's going to help the person feel like they're moving in the right direction. So in that sense, you're basically kind of picking a barrier out of the list and then saying, what's going to be the concrete measurable proof that this thing is getting better for the person in a way that matters, okay? So let me give you an illustration. So if you take Barbara here, she talks about how getting out in the community, being around people, it's a big part of her recovery. And it's connected to her long-term goal and vision. She wants to work with animals someday, okay? Currently, Barbara's wearing tinfoil on her head because she has a very fixed belief that it's the only thing that stops others from thought reading, okay? So she's embarrassed to leave the house without the tinfoil on her head, but when she goes outside without it, it causes her considerable distress because she feels very vulnerable, okay? So as a result, she's gotten really socially isolated and she hasn't gone to the dog park in over 3 weeks and she isn't making it to support groups. A traditional plan for Barbara could have the long-term goals be medication compliance and increase reality testing around delusions, okay? But we have an opportunity to do this in a much more person-centered way. And to think about the barriers, she's having distressing concerns related to feeling exposed and unsafe. She's having difficulty leaving the house. She's getting disconnected from supports, okay? Remember, Barbara's long-term goal is someday I want to work in the community with animals. And then an example might be of your short-term SMART goal. Within the next 2 months, Barbara's going to feel safe enough to resume her visits to the dog park at least once a week, right? And then if we were continuing on to the completion of all the plan elements, then we would all talk together about what are the professional and natural services and supports that can help her get there. Effective use of medications can still be an important part of that. Your very best therapies and treatment approaches can be a part of it. But also simple, safe, effective measures like a case manager saying, wear a baseball cap, keep your tinfoil, wear a baseball cap and get to the dog park, right? Simple things as well that can help people to concretely move forward. So I gave you a few examples and reminders around this technical criteria in your short-term goals. Many of you are probably familiar with this SMART criteria. What I want to make clear in this particular webinar, given our focus on long versus short-term goals, within the introductory training in this initiative, we are really talking about SMART criteria being applied at the level of the short-term goal, not the long-term person-centered vision statement, okay? So you want those to be simple or specific, measurable, concrete, like definitively. Read it out loud. Are you going to be able to say at the end of the time frame, is it achieved or is it not? Okay. And if you can't definitively answer that question, chances are it wasn't concretely measurable enough, and you got to go back and tighten it up. You want it to be relevant to the person, meaning it's targeting a barrier that is actually distressing to them and getting in the way of their long-term goal. And finally, you want it to be time-framed, okay? Time-framed or target date, okay? A question has come up around what are some tips around how do you set the target date? I hear all different things. What I would say to you is how you set that target date really depends on how modest or ambitious you and the person decide to be together. So for example, if you have a very modest short-term goal statement, it's a more of a learning oriented short-term goal that maybe a person is going to be able to verbally identify triggers to sensory overload where they then are struggling with their behavior. That's a learning objective. They might be able to verbally identify those things to you in 30 days, but actually applying that learning and then learning new skills to change that behavior, that might actually take a longer time. That might take 3 months, 6 months longer. So keep in mind, I typically always recommend, I love the value of an early quick win because people feel a sense of accomplishment with a short cycle time frame. But also, say you only have 2 short-term goals on your plan. You don't want both of those to be 1 month short-term goals, right? Because guess what you got to do at the end of 1 month? You have to have active short-term goals that you're pursuing on your plan. So you're going to have to open it up and you're going to have to revise it. And if you're doing that for 10 people or 100, it's not feasible or sustainable to continuously do that. So I typically recommend, again, sort of a mix and a variety of those target dates. I'm not going to go through these in detail because I did say I would leave a few minutes for questions, but I've just tried to offer a few examples here. You will get a copy of the slides, kind of our technical formula for crafting those short-term goals to hit the SMART criteria. So within what amount of time is a person going to have improvement in which documented barrier? There is your link back and your responsiveness to the assessment, which helps support your medical necessity, as evidenced by what kind of concrete, meaningful change in functioning or behavior, right? That's going to get them closer to the long-term goal. And then my last tip on your short-term goals and objectives is please, please remember, Short-term goals, also known as objectives, they really should not default to service participation, okay? A person can religiously and faithfully attend a day program every day for 25 years and still be socially connected, not get back to church, not move closer to getting an apartment of their own. Service participation alone doesn't necessarily get you to desired results, okay? So for example, in working with a trauma survivor that we'll call Wanda here, Wanda had been using self-injurious behaviors when she was very overwhelmed by intense emotions, okay? As a result of that, there was tension in Wanda's marriage, and she and her husband became estranged for a period of time. The team did a beautiful job in setting the long-term goal. I want to repair my relationship with my husband. But then when initially we dropped down to that short-term goal, it said, Wanda's going to attend cognitive behavioral therapy twice a week for 3 months. CBT, or any trauma-informed intervention, is a critical part of the plan, but it's not the short-term goal. It's the service or the intervention. The measurable, short-term, meaningful, SMART goal is a change in the behavior that's disrupting her life. Maybe she's going to use mindfulness to decrease self-injury, to no more than 1 incident per week for the next 90 days. Or maybe it's going to be extinguished to 0. It all depends on your conversations, okay? I'm not going to go into the poll here. I was going to end with another example in a poll, but there's lots of examples in your slides. And I did say I was going to leave a few questions, minutes for questions at the end. So I'm going to ask Robin, if you had happened to see anything pop into the chat that seemed like.
Yeah, there's a few. Laura says, I think where I get tripped up is my clinical needs to work on goals in the therapy setting. Sometimes the goals aren't worked on explicitly in the treatment therapy session, so it seems challenging to make goals. Any suggestions on how to overcome this?
Yeah, I think as long as each of your documentation components are connected, from like your long-term goal to your short-term goal to your intervention, for example. I'll use myself as an example. As a clinical psychologist, initially I thought that everything I documented had to be about, you know, again, like targeting diagnostic symptoms. I had to think about, how am I using my skills as a clinical psychologist to help a person be able to be organized enough to ride a city bus to get downtown so they can achieve their long-term goal of finding a girlfriend or having friends in the community. I had to think about how we could use our social skills group to help people who were struggling with communication, to learn how to take turns in conversations and have conversation starters, because those are the things that interfere with some of those longer term social goals. So I think if you maintain the connection between the two, you're going to have the thread. And hopefully, Laura, you'll see, take a look at the example that I offered. I think that'll help you as well. All right, let me see what else we got here. Wording is where I get stuck to make it measurable. Terry, what I would say to you, in the BHS toolkit, there is an entire topical category. There's one on goal and vision setting, which is the long-term goal. There's also a tab on PCP documentation. We have entire, like really user-friendly 2-page worksheets that are all about how do we write a measurable, SMART short-term goal and objective, okay, hitting some of those criteria I talked about. Miranda, how often should the short-term goal be reviewed, updated with the parents and the child, quarterly, monthly? So I can't speak to your particular program. And in fact, Robin really probably can't either, because those protocols really do differ based on service definition, based on funder expectations. But what I will tell you, aside from the policy and protocol, what I will tell you is that organically, the plan should be something that we're reflecting on each time we get together, meaning that you have a person or a family come in, you know, on January 29th, and I'm going to say to a person, well, when we met last time, Like, what did we talk about? Like, where did you want to be? You know, what's that short-term goal on the plan? Where did you want to be a couple of months from now? Are you making progress? Are you struggling? What's working? What's not working? So organically, I would say we're actually using it in the services and supports, but I can't, in the context of this webinar, speak to specific policies. I'm sorry, because they're different for every program. Let me see what else. Ingrid's reminding everyone that follow-up communications will provide a recording as well as the slides from today's event. They will go to the email address that you were registered under. Last but not least, my team is probably pushing me to move on to this. Please, please, please grab the QR code on the screen. Ingrid is also going to put the link into the chat box. This completion of this very brief, honestly, 30 seconds to a minute survey, it is required in order to get your MBCC certificate, and we will use it in a meaningful way to shape our future webinars. So please do grab the QR code or the link, and please do complete it within 2 weeks so that we can be sure to get your certificates. And with a training of this size, we had close to 500. We actually maxed out at 500 registrants. Please do give us about a month to get those out, because it's 2 weeks till we close the survey. Then we have to process all of those. So before you're emailing, please, again, give us a month, then check your spam box. Then after that, if you still haven't gotten it, you can reach out to Ingrid and we'll kind of troubleshoot to get it to you. All right. Well, we covered a lot of territory. We didn't get to our final example, but I hope that what we did offer in the examples that were in the slides, I hope they help to concretize this for all of you and to clarify some of the confusion that's out there around quality expectations in the long versus the short-term goals, okay? I'm going to put the code back up again. There you go, Sheila, grab the QR code. For those of you that are not using a phone, Ingrid has it in the chat box. Okay. All right. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sign off. Stay tuned for future details. There are additional webinars coming, and look forward to hopefully seeing many of you in a future event.
Thank you so much, Janice.
My pleasure.